Hi everybody. Today we'll be taking a close look at Web Messenger, which is an optional module in Vernon CMS where you can both track changes that are happening to data records within Vernon, and you can choose how to send that information to a third-party application. So some typical uses of that include sending records to an online collection system, including using our Vernon Browser module, and to third-party independent systems like a digital asset management system. For example, we have clients using Piction and PhotoWare, and they might want to keep and sync basic catalog data from Vernon CMS into that third-party system so that it's available for people working directly in the other system. We'll go through some typical examples of how Vernon uses Web Messenger. So one of the most common examples is for updating our own online collection product, Vernon Browser. So we have a public example of the Vernon Browser product in action, and I'm currently on that website. So just browser.vernonsystems.com. And I have open a collection record for a natural science specimen. If I look at this record, we can see there's actually a typo in that data. So we can see that somebody's accidentally misspelt one of the words in the description. Now, because that data is actually stored back in Vernon CMS, that's where we would need to edit it. And Web Messenger can help us publish those changes in almost real time. So let's switch over to Vernon CMS. And this is that same record. We can have a look at the Vernon Browser Web Messenger window to see what basic details it provides about what it's tracking and sending. That's available through the Tools menu, underneath Public Access, Web Messenger. Within Web Messenger, you can configure one or more queues. Each of those queues represents a third-party system which Vernon is sending the data to. In this particular example, we've just got one set up, and that's sending to a Vernon Browser website. So the queue column tells us the names of those destination services, in this case, Vernon Browser, but you might also have PhotoWare or a content management system, also as another system linked as a queue. And then for each of those queues, it will tell us how many records have been changed since it last sent updates across. So those updates aren't exactly in real time. What happens is that Vernon uses the audit log to detect that a change has been made, and then it adds it to a queue of changes that need to be sent across to that other system. Those changes are then dealt with either when a Vernon session is idle for a certain period. So you can set it, for example, that if Vernon is idle for 2 minutes, then start working through that backlog of changes. Or alternatively, you can use a dedicated session of Vernon, an indexing session we call it, to send those changes constantly as people are editing those records across your network. So let's have a look at that black stilt record and we can correct the change. So there's the particular word which had the typo. I'll just edit that. And so saving that record is enough to add it to the queue. So we can see that the queue length has gone up by 1. And then if I was to leave my session of Vernon idle now for a couple of minutes, it will process that change. We can also force the change to be immediate using the flush button on the right. So that immediately sends any records that are sitting in that queue as messages across to that other system. And we'd see that briefly flashing up in the bottom toolbar. Now, if we go across to the website, we can see that's already come across and there's our corrected word. And so how it's done that is by using the audit log to detect that a change was made. And then we can configure exactly which records and fields should be sent across to that other system. So let's dig into the configuration of that particular queue to see how that's done. By clicking on the configuration button, I can go to all the settings for that particular queue. We can use different programs in Vernon to format those messages in the way that makes sense to that third-party system. So we have our own module for packaging XML or structured data that Vernon Browser understands. We can then mark which of the files within Vernon we're wanting to track changes in. And in my case, I'm doing that for both the object file and the photo AV file. And then optionally, you can say that there's only certain records from that file based on a field which flags the records that are available for publishing. And so in my case, I'm using the published collection field, which is on the administration page of the catalog record, to mark which objects are ready to go online. Lastly, we can link this to a related report. So the argument column is for any extra settings that the system needs for processing all of this data. And in the case of the Vernon Browser module, that's just the ID of a saved report. And so I'll take a look at that saved report. So it's just using the generic reporting module to construct all of the settings that we want for which elements of data are going to send across to that other website. And that's just saved in Vernon as it would be normally. So every one of these reports in Vernon has its own unique permanent ID field. So that's what we were seeing in the argument field a minute ago. It's the unique ID for that report. So even if the title changed in the future, Web Messenger will still all work because it's linked to that particular permanent ID. And then within that report, we have all the rest of the settings. So I'll edit that report. And that's how we've selected exactly which fields from those records get sent across to the other system. So the object file might have hundreds of fields, but most of those aren't going to be relevant to the third-party service that you're sending this information to. In the case of my Vernon Browser example, we can see on the right that we're just showing typical descriptive information about those collection records, but we're not including things like acquisition or valuation information. Through that report is also how we can control whether related media records are also sent. So typically images that are connected to the object catalog records. And so in my case, we are exporting the related audio-visual material, but we're also controlling which of those go online. So we can restrict it further by saying only images which have been flagged as full public access should be published as part of this process. So Vernon Browser, for every object record that is changed, it's taking those fields and only the full public access images, and then it's packaging that all up as a message to send across to that other website. Lastly, in my case, I'm also taking the original image, and instead of sending that to the website, I'm actually creating a number of smaller web-sized images, which will be useful within the Vernon Browser interface, where it needs to present that image sometimes on a mobile phone or a tablet or a desktop at different sizes. So that's how we've controlled what information is sent. We've seen that when we edit a record, it's immediately added to the queue. So it's checking that flag field, and if the record is flagged as being online, it's publishing it. We can additionally force the update of a set of records by just manually adding a list of records to the queue. So an example of when that might be needed would be if you'd changed the images outside of Vernon and you just want to force that to go through to the website. I can do that using the Fill Queues option in the middle of the page. That just connects to Portfolio, where I can select a saved list and add those records to the queue, regardless of how recently they changed. So I've made a list earlier, which is just called vases to update. And I'll click OK. And then when I click on the Fill button, it'll check each of those and see whether they are actually valid to publish. And if they are, they'll be added to the queue here. I'll go across to the website and I'll show you one example of a record that is currently out of date. If we search for our vases, I've got a number of different vases there. We can see that one of them doesn't have an image, and that's because that record previously had the image marked as no public access. I've changed that this morning, but I wasn't tracking that detail at the time that I changed it. I hadn't yet set up Web Messenger. So now I want to retrospectively force an update of that record because it was changed before I'd configured Web Messenger as part of my system. That vase is one of the 4 that I've just added there. So clicking on flush again will force all of those records to go through. And we can see down the bottom in the status bar which record it's currently up to. So now if I go back to the website and we go into that FAM vase, I'll just double check that because that record doesn't yet have an image. So if I bring open that record, that would be a typical example of something which might go wrong in Web Messenger, that you may want to check why a particular record is not showing online. And so you'd want to check both of those things. Is it marked as being available online as a record? And is it available as an image related to that record? So firstly, the flag field was determining whether the record was available. We can see that this particular record is flagged as being one of the available published collections. So just simply having an entry in that flag field is enough to mark that that record is okay to go online. We do have sites with quite complex requirements where we use a calculated field or symbolic field to check a number of different rules, and then that calculated field can be the flag for whether or not a record goes online. So rather than having a field where you're entering data, that symbolic field can test certain conditions to do those checks. It might be checking that 3 different fields have to have data before it's able to go online, would be one example of a complex scenario. So secondly, we want to check the image for that record. And so this is why that particular record isn't online. So that's an example which you'd work through. If you saw a record which doesn't have its images online, that's the first place you would look. You'd see, well, is it actually perhaps unintentionally flagged as no public access, or maybe it's really not supposed to be online. So let's change that. And so now if I did the same thing of forcing the update of those vases online, so I'll just take that same list, add them to the queue, and then force them to update. And actually we can already see a difference. In the bottom line now I can see it's listing image files that it's resizing for me. If we go across to the website again, the images take a little bit longer to process because in Vernon Browser's case, it does some analysis on those images, such as color analysis and subject tagging. That may take it a little bit of time before it catches up. So I might leave that in the background while it does that image processing. So some other cases where you may have issues that you're wanting to investigate, the next thing that you'd look at would be the errors column. So the section down the bottom says which different workstations on your network are currently processing that queue. That might be restricted just to supervisor sessions, for example, and it'll say the name of the workstation, when they started processing that queue, how many records they've sent, and whether there were any errors that were encountered. So if that errors number is increasing, it does indicate that there's some kind of issue in the background. It could be that there's a firewall change in your network that's preventing Vernon from talking to Vernon Browser, or it could be an issue on the Vernon Browser server, or it could be a problem in the data itself, that there's something that Vernon doesn't understand. In that case, you can use the View Log button to see any errors there. So that'll show you a summary of the changes, and if you set it to detail level, it'll show you exactly what errors have occurred. That's going to be fairly technical, so at that point, usually we would be asking you to send us this log file. So you can just save this log file somewhere and send it as an email. It's just a text file with a list of dates and times and transaction information. In the configuration, normally we're not tracking the full detail of every single update, because that quickly builds up to a very long log file. And so that setting is part of the configuration. So at the moment, I've got this example set to detail, but for most of our clients, we would set it to just exceptions. That means the full details of an error will be logged, but otherwise, no other information is recorded in the log. And that's really the most practical level that you'd need. All the successful transactions, you don't necessarily need a full log of those, but if something goes wrong, that extra detail is useful for us for diagnosing that issue. I'll go back to the website now. That image has probably come through by now. And there it is. So that's an example of an update where it's not exactly in real time, but it will be within a few minutes of that change happening. So Vernon will do the necessary checks. It will package up the information, including the related images. And then if it's Vernon Browser that you're sending to, there's a little bit of time in the browser to do things like image analysis and text searching indexing. Other examples of sites that you might send that to would be a custom online collection system. So we've got clients such as Art Gallery of New South Wales that have developed their own online collection, and they're using Web Messenger as the way of keeping that information in sync. You might also send it to a digital asset management system, as I gave as an example. So we've got several different clients using both Fiction and Photoware, and you need to have basic catalog details in those products so that the photography team can manage their work independently in the digital asset management system. The clear button is used if for some reason there's some kind of problem with the configuration and you don't want any of the outstanding changes to be sent to the website. An example would be that if the report that had been set up for Web Messenger had the wrong information in it, you might immediately want to clear out that queue and not send any further changes to the website. So the clear button clears that whole queue. So I've got one thing sitting in the queue. Clicking on clear will just reset that, so there's nothing outstanding at this stage. The system does also keep a log of how many records have been found to have been changed and what the average length of the queue was. So that average length gives you a sense of how far behind is Web Messenger at any typical point. The reset stats just clears those figures. If you decided perhaps that had been skewed by a web service being down for a day, you might choose to reset stats, and all of those are just reset to 0 again. And from this point, it'll start tracking those numbers again for you. So just one further note about Web Messenger. It is involved in the technical integration between two independent systems. So it is one of the more complex areas in the system, and it's somewhere where we do often provide hands-on help. If you've got errors that are happening in the system, often you'll need our help to investigate those, because it could be a problem on a server that's outside of your control, or it could involve a discussion with your IT team with our assistants to try and track down things like firewall issues where the messages from Vernon are being blocked for some reason. So we're always happy as part of the support contract to help with investigating those things. Thank you very much for your time.